The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand corridors of Kensington Palace as Prince William walked slowly toward the East Wing. His footsteps echoed softly on the polished marble floors, each step carrying the weight of recent events that had shaken the royal family to its core. The past few weeks had been particularly challenging, with constant media attention and family tensions running higher than usual. William had always been known for his composed demeanor, but those closest to him could see the strain in his eyes. The responsibilities of being second in line to the throne, combined with his duties as a husband and father, sometimes felt overwhelming. Today was different, though. Today, he had received a message that would change everything. The message had come through his private secretary early that morning. It was brief but carried enormous significance. An elderly woman named Margaret Thompson had written to the palace, not seeking attention or publicity, but requesting a private moment with the prince. Her letter was unlike the thousands of others that arrived daily at the palace gates. This one spoke of loss, hope, and an extraordinary connection that dated back decades. Margaret's handwriting was shaky but determined. She had lost her husband of 60 years just 3 months ago, and in cleaning out his belongings, she had discovered something remarkable. Hidden in an old wooden box in their attic was a collection of letters and photographs that told an incredible story about the royal family that no one knew. Her late husband, Thomas Thompson, had been a quiet man who rarely spoke about his past. Margaret knew he had served in various capacities during his younger years, but he had always been modest about his experiences. What she found in that dusty box revealed that Thomas had played a crucial role in protecting members of the royal family during some of their most vulnerable moments, long before William was even born. The photographs showed Thomas as a young man, standing alongside royal protection officers during the 1970s and 1980s. But it wasn't his professional duties that made Margaret reach out to the palace. It was a series of personal letters written by a young Princess Diana, thanking Thomas for his kindness during some of her most difficult days. The letters revealed a side of Diana that the public never saw, and they mentioned specific acts of compassion that Thomas had shown her when she felt most alone. William's private secretary had been moved by Margaret's story and felt it deserved the prince's personal attention. The decision to meet with Margaret wasn't made lightly. Royal schedules are planned months in advance, and private audiences are rare. But something about this situation felt different, more urgent, as if it carried a deeper purpose. As William approached the designated meeting room, he reflected on his mother's legacy and how it continued to touch lives in unexpected ways. Diana had always emphasized the importance of human connection and genuine compassion. She had taught him that being royal meant serving others, not being served by them. These lessons had shaped his approach to his royal duties and his interactions with the public. The room where he would meet Margaret was smaller and more intimate than the grand staterooms usually used for official meetings. It had been chosen deliberately to create a comfortable environment where a genuine conversation could take place. Fresh flowers adorned a small table, and comfortable chairs were arranged to encourage open dialogue rather than formal presentation. William paused outside the door, taking a moment to center himself. He knew that whatever lay behind that door would be significant. Margaret's letter had hinted at revelations that could provide new insights into his mother's life, insights that might help him better understand the woman behind the public figure he remembered as his loving mother. His hand rested on the ornate door handle as he gathered his thoughts. The palace staff had briefed him on Margaret's background. She was 78 years old, a retired teacher who had dedicated her life to education and community service. She had no children of her own, but had influenced thousands of young lives throughout her career. Her husband, Thomas, had passed away peacefully, and she was now living alone in the same cottage they had shared for 4 decades. The weight of expectation hung in the air as William prepared to enter. He understood that this meeting represented more than just a courtesy call. It was an opportunity to connect with someone who had known his mother in a different context, someone who could share memories and perspectives that might help fill in pieces of the puzzle that was Diana's life. Taking a deep breath, William turned the handle and stepped into the room. What he saw there would indeed leave them both in tears, but not for the reasons anyone might have expected. Sometimes the most powerful moments in life come not from grand gestures or public ceremonies, but from quiet encounters between two, people who share an unexpected connection across time and circumstance. The door closed softly behind him as William entered what would become one of the most meaningful conversations of his life. A conversation that would reshape his understanding of his mother's impact on ordinary people and remind him of the profound responsibility that comes with his position. Margaret sat quietly in her chair, her weathered hands holding a small wooden box that contained treasures more valuable than any crown jewel. Margaret Thompson looked up as William entered the room, her eyes immediately brightening despite the obvious nervousness she felt. She had spent the previous night wondering if she was doing the right thing by reaching out to the palace. But seeing William's gentle expression put her somewhat at ease. He approached her with the kind of warmth that reminded her instantly of the stories her husband had told about his mother. "Mrs. Thompson," William said softly, extending his hand in greeting. "Thank you for writing to us. I understand you have something quite special to share." His voice carried genuine interest rather than the formal politeness one might expect from such an encounter. Margaret stood slowly, her aging joints protesting slightly, and shook his hand with surprising firmness. "Your Highness, I hardly know where to begin," Margaret replied, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "When I found these things among Thomas's belongings, I knew they belonged with you. He would have wanted you to have them, though he was always too humble to reach out himself." She gestured toward the wooden box that sat open on the small table between them. William took a seat across from her, leaning forward with evident curiosity. The box appeared to be handmade, worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, he could see the corner of what looked like photographs and the edges of handwritten letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The sight of his mother's distinctive handwriting on the visible envelope made his heart skip a beat. "Thomas never spoke much about his work," Margaret continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He was always so modest, so private about the important things he did. I knew he had worked in security and protection services, but he made it sound so ordinary. It wasn't until after the funeral, when I was going through his things, that I realized how extraordinary his service really was." She reached into the box and carefully withdrew the first photograph. It showed a young man in his 30s, clearly recognizable as Thomas, despite the decades that had passed. He was standing in what appeared to be a garden, and beside him was a young woman with distinctive blonde hair and kind eyes. Even in the informal snapshot, Diana's natural beauty and warmth were evident. "This was taken in 1982, Margaret explained, passing the photograph to William. "Thomas told me later that it was during one of the most difficult periods of your mother's early married life. She was struggling with the pressures of royal life, feeling isolated and overwhelmed. Thomas wasn't assigned as her personal protection officer, but somehow she began to trust him." William studied the photograph intently, noting how relaxed and genuine his mother appeared. This wasn't the polished public Diana that the world knew, but rather a young woman who seemed to have found a moment of peace. His fingers traced the edges of the photo as Margaret continued her story. "Your mother was lonely," Margaret said gently. "Thomas used to tell me that she would sometimes seek out the staff members who seemed kind, just to have someone to talk to who didn't want anything from her. He said she had an incredible ability to remember details about people's lives, asking about their families and their concerns. She made everyone feel important." The next item Margaret retrieved from the box was the bundle of letters tied with the blue ribbon. She wrote these to Thomas over several years. Not many, perhaps a dozen in total, but each one meant so much to him. She would send them after particularly difficult days, thanking him for small kindnesses that probably seemed insignificant to him, but meant the world to her. William's hands shook slightly as he accepted the letters. The familiar sight of his mother's handwriting brought back a flood of memories. He had seen her write countless notes and letters during his childhood, always taking time to personalize her communications rather than relying solely on typed correspondence. "Would you mind if I read one?" William asked, his voice barely above, a whisper. Margaret nodded encouragingly, understanding the profound significance of this moment for him. With careful fingers, William untied the ribbon and selected the letter on top of the stack. The letter was dated October 15th, 1984, written on cream-colored stationery with Diana's personal monogram at the top. As William began to read, his mother's voice seemed to come alive in his mind. She wrote about feeling grateful for Thomas's patience during a particularly challenging public appearance where she had been overwhelmed by crowds and photographers. She thanked him for quietly positioning himself where she could see his reassuring presence, and for the cup of tea he had arranged for her afterward without being asked. "She noticed everything," William murmured, looking up at Margaret with wonder in his eyes. "Every small gesture, every moment of kindness. She saw it all and remembered it." Margaret nodded, tears beginning to form in her own eyes as she witnessed the prince's emotional response to discovering this new dimension of his mother's character. Thomas said she had the most remarkable memory for people's birthdays, their children's names, even their pets, Margaret shared. She would ask him about his garden, about my teaching, about our hopes to travel someday. When we finally did take that trip to Scotland in 1987, she sent us a postcard wishing us well. Thomas kept it until the day he died. The room fell silent as William continued reading through the letters, each one revealing more about his mother's private struggles and her genuine appreciation for the people who supported her during her most vulnerable moments. These weren't the formal thank you notes of a royal figure fulfilling obligations, but rather the heartfelt expressions of a young woman who had found unexpected friendship in the most unlikely places. One letter, dated shortly after William's own birth, spoke of Diana's joy at becoming a mother and her determination to raise her children with an understanding of how blessed they were. She wrote about wanting William and eventually Harry to grow up knowing that their position came with responsibilities to serve others, not to be served by them. As William read these intimate thoughts from his mother, written during some of her most formative years as a royal and as a parent, he began to understand that this meeting with Margaret was about much more than discovering old letters and photographs. It was about connecting with the lasting impact his mother had made on individual lives, the ripple effects of her compassion that continued decades after her death. As William continued reading through the collection, one particular letter caught his attention. It was longer than the others and written in what appeared to be a moment of deep reflection. The date showed December 1985, a time when Diana was still adjusting to the immense pressures of royal life while caring for young William, who would have been just over 3 years old. In this letter, Diana wrote candidly about her fears and hopes as a mother. She confided in Thomas about her determination to give her children as normal a childhood as possible within the constraints of their royal position. She expressed worry about the media attention already surrounding young William and her resolve to protect him from the more harmful aspects of public scrutiny. "She wrote this after that photographer followed you to your nursery school," Margaret explained, noticing which letter William was reading. "Thomas told me she was absolutely furious, not for herself, but because someone had frightened you. He said she spent hours that day making sure all the security protocols were reviewed to better protect you and the other children at the school." William's eyes misted as he read his mother's words about wanting him to grow up understanding both his privileges and his responsibilities. She wrote about taking him to visit homeless shelters and hospitals, not for publicity, but because she believed it was essential for him to see how others lived and to develop genuine compassion for those less fortunate. "I remember those visits," William said quietly, setting the letter down for a moment. "I thought it was just normal, that all children went to see sick people and help serve meals to those who needed them. I didn't realize until much later how intentional she was being about teaching me those lessons. Margaret smiled through her tears. Thomas always said your mother was raising you to be a different kind of royal. She wanted you to understand that your position was meant to be used in service of others, not for personal gain. He admired that about her tremendously. The next photograph in the collection showed a scene that was both ordinary and extraordinary. It captured Thomas pushing young William on a swing in what appeared to be a private garden, while Diana sat nearby on a bench laughing at something William had said. The image radiated pure joy and normalcy, a rare glimpse of the royal family, simply being a family. This was taken during one of the rare occasions when your mother could arrange for you to play outside without official photographers present, Margaret explained. Thomas wasn't supposed to be playing with you, of course, but you had asked him to push the swing and your mother insisted that he should. She said children needed to interact with different people, not just royal staff and dignitaries. William studied the photograph carefully, trying to recall the moment. He could almost hear his mother's laughter and feel the excitement of being pushed higher and higher on the swing. What struck him most was how natural and unguarded everyone appeared in the image. This wasn't a staged royal photo opportunity, but rather a spontaneous moment of happiness captured in time. Thomas treasured this photograph, Margaret continued. He said it represented everything he admired about your mother. She could have insisted on formal protocols and kept distance between her family and the staff, but instead she chose to create moments of genuine human connection. He said she understood that kindness was more important than ceremony. Another letter revealed Diana's concerns about maintaining her own identity while fulfilling her royal duties. She wrote to Thomas about feeling torn between the person she naturally was and the person she was expected to be in public. She appreciated having people like Thomas around who knew her as simply Diana, not as a princess or a future queen, but as a young woman trying to navigate an extraordinarily complex life. She valued authenticity above almost everything else, Margaret observed as William read this particular letter. Thomas said she would ask the staff about their real opinions on things, not just what they thought she wanted to hear. She wanted genuine relationships even within the formal structure of royal life. William found another photograph that showed Diana sitting with several palace staff members around a kitchen table, sharing what appeared to be an informal meal. Everyone in the image looked relaxed and happy, as if they were simply friends, gathering together rather than a princess dining with her employees. She insisted on these informal gatherings whenever possible, Margaret explained. Thomas said she would arrange for coffee and cake in the staff kitchen just to have normal conversations with people. She wanted to know about their families, their dreams, their challenges. She made everyone feel valued and heard. The impact of these revelations was beginning to overwhelm William. He was discovering layers of his mother's character that he had been too young to fully appreciate during her lifetime. While he had always known she was compassionate and caring, these letters and photographs revealed the deliberate and consistent nature of her efforts to connect with people on a human level. "There's something else," Margaret said softly, reaching deeper into the wooden box. Thomas wrote something himself, shortly before he became ill. He wanted to make sure these stories were preserved, not for history books or biographies, but for you and Harry. He felt you deserved to know how much your mother's kindness meant to ordinary people. She handed William a handwritten note in her husband's careful script. Thomas had written about the privilege of witnessing Diana's genuine compassion during some of her most challenging years. He described her as someone who understood that true nobility came from how one treated others, especially those who could offer nothing in return. The note concluded with Thomas's observation that Diana had been preparing William for leadership, not through formal lessons about protocol and duty, but through daily examples of empathy and service. He had watched her teach William to notice people who were sad or struggling, to remember their names, and to find ways to help, even in small ways. Reading these words from someone who had observed his mother so closely during his early childhood William began to understand that his approach to royal duties had been shaped by lessons he hadn't even realized he was learning. The foundation of his own charitable work, his commitment to mental health awareness, and his determination to modernize. The monarchy had all been influenced by his mother's quiet teachings during those formative years. William set down Thomas's note and looked across at Margaret, who was watching him with the tender expression of someone who understood the profound impact of what she had just shared. The silence in the room was comfortable, filled with the weight of meaningful discovery rather than awkwardness. Both of them seemed to sense that they were experiencing something that would change them both forever. "Mrs. Thompson," William began, his voice thick with emotion, "I cannot adequately express how much this means to me. These letters, these photographs, they're showing me a side of my mother that I was too young to fully understand at the time. They're helping me see how intentional she was about everything she did." Margaret nodded, reaching for a tissue from the small table beside her chair. "Thomas always said that your mother was the most purposeful person he ever met. Nothing she did was accidental. Every kindness, every conversation, every moment she spent with people was deliberate. She understood that her position gave her the power to make people feel valued, and she never wasted that opportunity." William picked up another photograph, this one showing Diana kneeling beside a hospital bed, holding the hand of an elderly patient. The image captured not just a royal visit, but a moment of genuine human connection. Diana's face showed complete focus on the person she was with, as if nothing else in the world mattered at that moment. "Thomas took this photograph during one of the private hospital visits," Margaret explained. "Your mother insisted that some of her visits be completely private, with no press coverage or official photographers. She said the purpose was to bring comfort to people who were suffering, not to create publicity for herself. Thomas was sometimes asked to document these moments, but only for her personal records." The photograph revealed something William had suspected but never confirmed. His mother's public charitable work, which had been extensively documented and celebrated, represented only a fraction of her actual compassionate activities. Much of what she did happened away from cameras and reporters, driven purely by her desire to help others rather than by any obligation or expectation. "She would spend hours in that hospital," Margaret continued, "not just walking through wards and greeting patients, but sitting with people who had no visitors, reading to children who were scared, listening to elderly patients who wanted to share their life stories. Thomas said she had an extraordinary ability to make each person feel like they were the most important person in the world." William found another letter that mentioned his younger brother Harry, written shortly after Harry's birth in 1984. Diana wrote about her hopes that both her sons would grow up understanding the difference between being important and being valuable. She wanted them to find their worth in what they contributed to others' lives rather than in the titles and privileges they had inherited. She was already thinking about Harry's future role, even when he was just a baby, William observed, reading aloud a passage where Diana expressed her determination to raise both sons with strong moral foundations. She wrote that she wanted us to be the kind of men who would use our positions to lift others up, not to elevate ourselves. Margaret smiled at this. "Thomas used to say that your mother was playing a very long game. She wasn't just raising princes. She was raising future leaders who would understand that true leadership means service." He believed she was quietly revolutionizing what it meant to be royal, one conversation and one act of kindness at a time. The next item in the box was a small journal that Thomas had kept during his years of service. Margaret explained that he had written brief notes about significant moments, not for any official purpose, but to help him remember the remarkable things he witnessed. The entries were short but powerful, capturing Diana's character through specific incidents and observations. One entry described a day when Diana had noticed that a young palace staff member seemed upset. Rather than ignoring it or delegating someone else to inquire, she had personally taken the time to find out what was wrong. The staff member's mother was seriously ill, and Diana had quietly arranged for the best possible medical care and had personally visited the woman in the hospital. The remarkable thing, Margaret said as William read this entry, was that this wasn't unusual behavior for your mother. Thomas wrote dozens of similar stories. She was constantly noticing when people were struggling and finding ways to help, always quietly, always without seeking recognition. Another journal entry described Diana's interaction with a group of homeless individuals during what was supposed to be a brief, formal visit to a shelter. Instead of following the planned schedule, she had sat down with several people and listened to their stories for over an hour. Thomas noted that she remembered details from these conversations and would ask about specific individuals during subsequent visits months later. She never forgot anyone, William murmured, reading through more of Thomas's observations. Every person she met became important to her. She carried their stories with her and continued to care about their welfare long after their initial meeting. Margaret reached into the box one more time and withdrew what appeared to be a child's drawing. It was clearly created by young William, showing stick figures that were labeled Mummy, William, and Thomas. The drawing depicted them in a garden with a large sun shining overhead and flowers scattered around them. "You gave this to Thomas when you were about 4 years old," Margaret explained, her voice growing softer. "Your mother had told you that Thomas was a friend of the family, and you insisted on drawing this picture for him. She was so pleased that you saw him as more than just someone who worked at the palace." William stared at the drawing, memories, flooding back of the security of his early childhood when the world seemed simpler and the adults around him felt like an extended family rather than employees and officials. He could remember feeling safe and loved, not just by his mother, but by the network of caring people she had deliberately cultivated around her children. "Thomas kept this drawing in his wallet for over 30 years, Margaret continued. Whenever people asked him about his work, he would show them this picture and say it represented the greatest privilege of his career, being trusted by your mother to be part of your childhood and being valued by you as a friend rather than just a guard." The emotional weight of these discoveries was beginning to transform William's understanding, not just of his mother, but of his own responsibility to continue her legacy. He was seeing how she had used every interaction, every relationship, every moment of her life to create positive change in the world, often in ways that no one would ever know about or recognize. William carefully placed the child's drawing back in the box, his hands trembling slightly as the full impact of this meeting began to settle in his heart. He looked up at Margaret, who was watching him with the kind of understanding that comes from a lifetime of caring for others. In her eyes, he could see reflection of his mother's own compassion, the same quality that had drawn Thomas to preserve these precious memories. "Mrs. Thompson," William said, his voice barely above a whisper, "these treasures you've shared with me today have given me something I didn't even know I was missing. They've shown me that my mother's influence reached so much further than I ever realized, touching lives in ways that were never recorded or celebrated, but were perhaps the most important work she ever did." Margaret leaned forward, her aged hands folded gently in her lap. "Thomas often said that your mother understood something that many people in positions of power never learn. She knew that the most lasting impact comes not from grand gestures or public speeches, but from countless small acts of genuine kindness. She lived every day as if each person she encountered mattered deeply." William found himself thinking about his own work, his charitable foundations, and his approach to royal duties. For years, he had been trying to honor his mother's memory through public service and advocacy. But now he was beginning to understand that the most important lessons she had taught him were the ones he had absorbed unconsciously as a child, watching her treat every person with dignity and respect. "There's one more thing I need to show you," Margaret said softly, reaching into the very bottom of the wooden box. She withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, with William's name written on it in Diana's distinctive handwriting. "Thomas found this among your mother's personal papers after the accident. Someone had given it to him to keep safe with instructions that it should only be given to you when you were old enough to understand its meaning. William's hands shook as he accepted the envelope. The weight of it seemed far greater than its physical mass, as if it contained not just words on paper but years of love and wisdom waiting to be shared. He looked questioningly at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "Thomas waited many years to decide when the right time would be," she explained. "After he became ill, he told me that he believed the right time would make itself known. When I read about your recent charitable work, your efforts to continue your mother's legacy, I knew that time had come." With infinite care, William opened the envelope and withdrew several pages of his mother's writing. The letter was dated just 2 months before her death, written during what Thomas had described as a period of deep reflection for Diana. She had been thinking about her sons' futures and her hopes for the kind of men they would become. The letter began with Diana's expression of love for William, but quickly moved into deeper territory. She wrote about her hopes that he would understand the true purpose of his royal position, that he would see it not as a burden or a privilege, but as an opportunity to serve others in ways that could make a real difference in the world. "My dearest William," the letter read, "if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you to guide you in person. But please know that everything I tried to teach you during our time together was meant to prepare you for the important work you are meant to do. Your position gives you a platform that most people will never have, and with that platform comes the responsibility to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves." Diana went on to write about specific qualities she had tried to instill in William: empathy for those who suffer, humility despite his elevated position, and the understanding that true leadership means lifting others up rather than standing above them. She encouraged him to remember that behind every title, every statistic, every social issue, there were real people with real stories who deserved to be seen and heard. "I hope you will remember the people we visited together," the letter continued. "The children in the hospitals, the families in the shelters, the elderly people who just needed someone to listen to their stories. Each of them taught us something important about resilience, about hope, about the fundamental goodness that exists in most people if we take the time to look for it." William paused in his reading, tears flowing freely now as his mother's voice came alive in these pages. Margaret handed him a tissue, her own eyes moist with emotion, as she witnessed this profoundly personal moment. The letter concluded with Diana's vision for William's future role in the monarchy. She wrote about her hope that he would help modernize the institution, making it more accessible and relevant to ordinary people. She wanted him to use his position to break down barriers between the royal family and the public, to show that being royal was not about being separate from or superior to others, but about being in service to them. "Remember," the letter ended, "that the crown you may one day wear is not a symbol of your importance, but a reminder of your responsibility. Every day you have the opportunity to make someone's life a little better, to bring hope where there is despair, to show kindness where there is suffering. This is the real work of royalty, and it is the most important work you will ever do." William set the letter down and sat in silence for several moments, absorbing the weight of his mother's words and the incredible gift that Margaret and Thomas had preserved for him. The room seemed to hold its breath as both he and Margaret processed the significance of this moment. "She knew," William finally said, looking up at Margaret through his tears. "She knew that someday I would need these reminders, these examples of how to live a life that matters. She was still teaching me, even after all these years." Margaret smiled through her own tears. "Thomas always said that your mother was the wisest person he ever met. She understood that love is not just a feeling, but an action. Every day she chose to love people through her words and deeds, and she raised you to do the same." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room where two people had shared something extraordinary. William realized that this meeting had given him more than just memories and artifacts. It had given him a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of the legacy he was meant to carry forward. As the golden afternoon light filled the room, William and Margaret sat in comfortable silence, both of them changed by what they had shared. The wooden box sat open between them, its contents having revealed far more than old photographs and letters. It had opened a window into the heart of a woman whose influence continued to ripple through lives decades after her death. William carefully gathered the letters and photographs, handling each piece with the reverence reserved for sacred artifacts. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice steady now but filled with deep emotion, "I want you to know that what you and Thomas have given me today is beyond precious. These memories, these insights into my mother's character, they've shown me dimensions of her love that I was too young to fully appreciate when she was alive." Margaret nodded, understanding the profound nature of what had transpired. "Thomas would be so pleased to know that these treasures found their way to you. He often worried that too much focus was placed on your mother's public work, important as it was, while the daily kindnesses that truly defined her character went unrecognized. He wanted you to know about the private Diana, the woman who cared, about individual people rather than just causes." William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where he had once played as a child, where his mother had taught him to notice the beauty in simple things, the weight of the letter she had written to him, the wisdom contained in Thomas's observations, and the love preserved in Margaret's stewardship of these memories had crystallized something important in his mind. "I've been trying for years to honor my mother's memory through my public work," he said, turning back to Margaret. "But now I understand that the most important way to honor her is to carry forward the lessons she taught me about seeing each person as valuable, about using whatever influence I have to make individual lives better, about leading with empathy rather than authority." Margaret smiled, recognizing in William's words the echo of conversations she had had with Thomas over the years. "Your mother would be so proud of the man you've become. Thomas used to say that she was raising you to be a different kind of royal, someone who would understand that true nobility comes from service, not from being served." William returned to his chair, his mind already working through the implications of what he had learned. "I want to do something to honor Thomas's memory and to continue the work my mother began. Would you be willing to help me establish a foundation, in Thomas's name, something that would support the kind of quiet, individual acts of kindness that he witnessed and that meant so much to my mother?" The suggestion caught Margaret by surprise, and she felt tears welling up again. Thomas would be overwhelmed by such an honor. He was always so humble about his service, so modest about the extraordinary things he witnessed. But yes, I think he would love the idea of helping others continue the work of bringing kindness into individual lives. They spent the next hour discussing possibilities, sharing ideas about how such a foundation might work. William envisioned something that would support people like Thomas, those who work quietly behind the scenes to care for others, who notice when someone is struggling and find ways to help. The foundation would celebrate and enable the kind of one-on-one compassion that had defined his mother's approach to life. As their conversation drew to a close, William carefully placed all the letters and photographs back in the wooden box. "These will be treasured always," he promised Margaret. "Not just as family keepsakes, but as reminders of what really matters, of how one person's consistent kindness can touch countless lives." Margaret stood to leave, but before she did, she reached into her handbag and withdrew one final item. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages blank. Thomas bought this shortly before he became ill. He said he hoped that someday someone would continue documenting acts of kindness, that the tradition of noticing and recording when people help each other wouldn't end with him. William accepted the journal with deep gratitude, understanding the significance of the gesture. "I promise you that this tradition will continue. The stories of kindness, the moments when people choose to help each other, they'll be preserved and celebrated." As they walked together toward the door, Margaret paused and looked back at the room where they had spent the afternoon. You know, when I woke up this morning, I was just a lonely widow missing her husband and wondering if I was doing the right thing by reaching out to you. Now I feel like Thomas is somehow still here with us, still making a difference, still connecting people in meaningful ways. William stopped beside her, following her gaze back into the room that had become sacred space for both of them. Mrs. Thompson, I believe that the best people never really leave us. Their influence continues through every life they touched, every kindness they inspired, every moment of love they shared. Thomas lives on in these memories, in the foundation we'll create in his name, and in the countless acts of compassion that will be inspired by his example. As they stepped into the corridor, William realized that this afternoon had given him something he hadn't even known he needed. For years, he had carried the weight of trying to live up to his mother's public legacy, feeling the pressure to make grand gestures and significant impacts. Now he understood that the most important legacy was simpler and yet more profound. The commitment to see every person as valuable, to notice when someone needs help, and to respond with genuine kindness. Before you leave, William said as they reached the main entrance, I want to ask you something. Would you consider being involved with the foundation we discussed? Your wisdom, your understanding of what Thomas valued, your own experience as someone who has dedicated her life to caring for others, it would be invaluable. Margaret's face lit up with a mixture of surprise and joy. I would be honored beyond words. Thomas always said that the most important work happens when people come together to help each other. To be part of continuing that work especially, in his memory, would give my remaining years more meaning than I ever dared hope for. They exchanged contact information, making plans to meet again soon to begin the practical work of establishing the foundation. As Margaret prepared to leave, she turned back to William one final time. Your Highness, I hope you know that today you've given me as much as I've given you. You've shown me that Thomas's quiet service mattered, that the stories he preserved have value, and that the kindness he witnessed continues to inspire new kindness. That's the greatest gift anyone could receive. William watched as Margaret's car pulled away from the palace, carrying with it a woman whose life had been transformed by an afternoon of sharing memories and discovering connections. He stood in the doorway for several minutes, holding the wooden box and the blank journal, thinking about the responsibility and opportunity that lay ahead. That evening, William called his brother Harry to share what he had discovered. The conversation lasted for hours as he read passages from their mother's letters and described the photographs that showed a side of Diana they had been too young to fully understand. Harry was moved to tears as he learned about their mothers' deliberate efforts to raise them with empathy and purpose. She was still teaching us, Harry said, his voice filled with wonder. Even now, all these years later, she's still showing us how to live, how to love, how to serve others. It's like she knew we would need these reminders when we were old enough to truly understand them. In the days that followed, William began incorporating the lessons from his afternoon with Margaret into his daily life. He started carrying the small journal Thomas had intended for recording acts of kindness, documenting moments when he witnessed people helping each other, when staff members went beyond their duties to care for others, when strangers showed compassion to those in need. The foundation established in Thomas's memory became a reality within months, supporting individuals who dedicate themselves to quiet acts of service. The first recipients included a nurse who spent her own time reading to elderly patients, a teacher who used his personal resources to help struggling students, and a security guard who had noticed and helped a homeless veteran find housing and support. Years later, when people asked William about the moment that most shaped his approach to royal duty, he would think of that afternoon with Margaret Thompson and the wooden box filled with treasures. He would remember discovering that his mother's greatest legacy was not in the grand charitable works that made headlines, but in the countless individual lives she had touched with genuine kindness and respect. the blank journal that Thomas had. Left Behind was eventually filled with hundreds of stories of compassion, becoming the foundation for a movement that celebrated and encouraged the kind of quiet heroism that happens when people choose to care for each other. And in palace corridors that had once echoed with the footsteps of a young princess determined to change the world one person at a time, her son continued that work, carrying forward the understanding that true nobility is measured not by titles or ceremonies, but by the depth of one's commitment to serving others with love.